Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I am very pleased to support this long overdue amendment to the Racial Discrimination Act. After numerous broken promises by the government, policy flip-flops and resistance to just plain common sense, I am delighted to see that reason has finally taken the day and the government has accepted One Nation's argument that the Racial Discrimination Act needs to be changed. This government-sponsored Human Rights Legislation Amendment Bill 2017 seeks to remove the words insult, humiliate and offend from Section 18C of the Act as grounds for the charge of racial vilification and replace them with the word harass. It also seeks to help filter out frivolous or vexatious complaints and require the Human Rights Commission to advise those who are the subject of complaints as soon as they are received. Pauline Hanson's One Nation welcomes these changes as long overdue, and whilst we would like to see far greater changes, such as the complete removal of Part 2A of the Racial Discrimination Act, which contains these provisions, removal altogether, the government has at least taken a significant step in the right direction. At least limiting complaints to harassment imposes a requirement for an objectively measurable event as a trigger, rather than the current ridiculous situation in which complaints are derived from a subjective, emotional state and therefore can be based on a whim. As most people in Australia are aware, to their cost, the now infamous Racial Discrimination Act 1975 purports to prohibit offensive behaviour on racial hatred, but in reality is simply a blatant attack on free speech. This draconian law has been used to silence individuals such as reporter Andrew Bolt and the late, great and respected cartoonist Bill Leak, who had the temerity to make comments not in accordance with the politically correct, half-baked opinions of the left-wing controlling elites. Mr Acting Deputy President, if the Senate will indulge me, I would like to recount a little history of this truly reprehensible piece of extreme leftist control legislation. The Racial Discrimination Act was first enacted by the failed Whitlam government in 1975. This act purported to make so-called racial discrimination unlawful in Australia and override inconsistent state and territory legislation using the external affairs power contained in Section 51 of our Australian Constitution. As my Senate colleagues will be aware, the external affairs power has been regularly abused by both Labor and coalition governments since then in order to override the rights of the states to make laws, contrary to the intent of the founders of our Constitution. In the case of the Racial Discrimination Act, the basis for use of the external affairs power was the signing of the so-called United Nations International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in the dying days of the Whitlam government, which was in turn adopted by the UN based on an original proposal by the Soviet Union in 1948, which sought to align democratic Western governments with Soviet policy. In 1948, following the Nuremberg trials, world leaders gathered to construct a lofty-sounding Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Soviet representatives argued that to prevent a resurgence of Nazism, free speech should be qualified by banning so-called hate speech. The Soviets advocated making it a crime to advocate national, racial or religious hostility, but not, of course, class hostility. In other words, to say anything with which they self-righteously disagreed. Such efforts to supposedly combat hate by denying freedom of speech were vehemently opposed by Western delegates, including even the left-leaning Eleanor Roosevelt, who wisely said a hate speech qualification would be extremely dangerous since, quote, any criticism of public or religious authorities might all too easily be described as an incitement to hatred. Mrs. Roosevelt and other delegates knew well that similar laws in the pre-war Weimar Republic had not only failed to prevent the rise of the Nazis, but had been successfully used by the Nazis to silence their critics, much as radical Muslim groups and their apologists do now. The Soviets lost on their hate speech gambit in 1948, but were finally successful in 1965 with the creation of the UN's lofty-sounding International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which contained a section calling for the criminalisation of, quote, ideas based on racial superiority or hatred. This belated victory and its subsequent adoption in 1975 by the Whitlam Labor government here in our country represented the triumph of the Soviet view of free speech as bad and censorship as good. Of course, Mr. Acting Deputy President, not ready to be outdone in the repression of liberty stakes, in 1995 the Keating Labor government went one better and added Section 18C. Keating's amendment states inter alia, quote, it is unlawful for a person to do an act otherwise done in private if A, the act is reasonably likely in all the circumstances to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person or a group of people, and B, the act is done because of the race, colour or national or ethnic origin of the other person or of some or all of the people in the group. While some may believe that this act reflects some high-minded principle of fairness and justice, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The hallmark of the Soviet Union was the corruption of language, the hijacking of language to become an instrument of oppression, calling war peace and slavery freedom, for example, and this was no different. The pretense of protecting people from injustice was in fact a Trojan horse to silence those who dared to dissent from the Communist Party line. Now, those of us in this parliament who believe passionately in the right to free speech are implacably opposed to this Soviet legal landmine and strongly support this amendment. Unfortunately, Mr. Acting Deputy President, the Liberal Party appears to have had a checkered history on this issue and several other key principles of classical liberalism, such as low taxes and responsible government spending. Like identical poles of a magnet, the Liberal Party and freedom of speech appear to have repeatedly approached one another, only to be repelled by some invisible yet irresistible force. When Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Tony Abbott, with square jaw and steely gaze, publicly committed his future government to repealing 18C following the Bolt case. However, once elected Prime Minister, Mr. Acting Deputy President, Mr. Abbott's gaze seemed to drift out of focus. His jaw seemed to slacken. The member for Warringah suddenly decided that the promised change was, quote, a complication to his planned overhaul of terror laws. Perhaps it was the squeak of ministerial leather, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Perhaps the raised voices and clenched fist of the enemies of liberty who opposed the change. But either way, Mr. Abbott folded like a cheap umbrella. However, this pesky free speech idea just wouldn't die, would it? In March last year, the Australian Law Reform Commission called for a review of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. Following a laborious 2-year inquiry into Commonwealth laws that encroach on traditional rights and freedoms, and an examination of whether those laws are properly justified, in a 592-page report tabled by Senator Brandis, the Australian Law Reform Commission questioned whether the Racial Discrimination Act unjustifiably interferes with freedom of speech. The report further questioned whether Section 18C was even constitutional, pointing out its validity had never been tested before the High Court. Very promisingly, Mr. Acting Deputy President, Senator Brandis was quoted at the time as saying that the government was, quote, committed to preserving and maintaining the freedoms which underpin the principles of democracy. To this end, Senator Brandis said, and I quote, I have written to my ministerial colleagues asking them to carefully consider what might be taken in relation to the laws, what action might be taken in relation to the laws which the Commission has identified as warranting further consideration. It is regrettable that we then had to wait another 12 months for this to bear fruit. Happily, it seems that the member for Warringah's successor, the current Prime Minister, Mr Malcolm Turnbull, may well be undergoing a journey in the opposite direction to Mr Abbott. Having initially stated that free speech was, quote, not a priority for his government, I am heartened to see that under pressure from One Nation, there are encouraging signs of a Damascene conversion. Whether or not the centrist flip-floppers on the crossbench torpedo the current amendment, I very much hope that the Prime Minister's conversion will prove to be the case. It is a scientific fact, Mr Acting Deputy President, that given sufficient time, the jellyfish did eventually evolve into the vertebrate. Now, although it seems hard to believe today, with neo-Stalinists like the member for Sydney lurking one heartbeat from the Labor leadership, in fact, historically, the Labor Party was not hostile to the principle of freedom of speech at all. Enlightened former Labor leadership figures such as John Curtin, Ben Chifley, Peter Baldwin and Barry Cohen certainly seem to have had a strong appreciation of the importance of this issue. However, today, very sadly, Labor is marching determinedly to a different drum. As the anaconda-like grip of the socialist left progressively tightens around the Labor Party, tolerance for opinions dissenting from left-wing orthodoxy is on its last gasp. As for the Greens, well, all I can say is that repression of freedom of speech could have no more eloquent a champion. The smug, elitist sense of superiority that infuses these koala-hugging commos appears to leave them without the slightest awareness of the terrible repression which they champion in their pursuit of ideological conformity with their own, frankly, anti-human worldview. Even the possibility that someone else might hold a legitimate and well-reasoned opinion that differs from theirs appears to simply be beyond their comprehension. Of course, the absurdity of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act is that, in truth, government can legislate to regulate behaviour but cannot regulate feelings. Whether or not someone insults and offends is an entirely subjective matter in the mind of the beholder. Section 18C actually weakens and disempowers people. It turns people into victims. As my crossbench colleague, Senator David Leyonhjelm, says, the truth, Mr. Acting Deputy President, is that offence may only be taken, not given. The idea that the world is otherwise is simply a rose-tinted left-wing fantasy. But then, Mr. Acting Deputy President, a colourful lunar landscape seems to be a pretty accurate description of the green vision of society. Transgender pixies riding their solar-powered unicorns over oh-so-sustainable rainbows seems to be a more accurate representation. Throughout this debate, a common rhetorical question asked by senators like the former Speaker, Senator Billick, and like members like Mr. Bill Shorten on the control side of politics is this: what is it that you think people want to say but can't say under the current legislation? The answer to this fatuous question is obviously just the truth. That's all we want to hear, just the truth. When Bill Leake called out Aboriginal mistreatment of their own children, the enemies of free speech swooped and charged him. But as demonstrated by the Northern Territory intervention, rampant child sexual abuse, neglect and drug-taking in Northern Territory Aboriginal communities is simply fact. Because of laws like the Racial Discrimination Act, ordinary, decent people are simply afraid to speak the truth, because the truth can get you arrested, fined, or even jailed.
Order.
So if your Muslim Sudanese neighbour is engaging in female genital mutilation, or your Syrian Muslim cafe owner is a terrorist building a bomb, or maybe just the Afghan Muslims in the public housing flat next to you are molesting small children, chances are that you are afraid to speak out. Similar laws overseas have led to exactly this. In the UK, where similar anti-liberal restrictions on freedom of speech exist, 1,400 children were raped by Pakistani Muslim gangs in Rotherham. But in the words of the inquiry into this mass crime, quote,
Order.
Staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for fear of being thought racist. In San Bernardino in the US, where a Muslim terrorist killed 14 innocent—
Senator Roberts, resume your seat. Senator Roberts is entitled to be heard in silence, as are all senators. Senator Roberts, you have the call.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. In San Bernardino in the US, where a Muslim terrorist killed 14 innocent people, neighbours of the killers subsequently admitted that they did not report suspicious activity because they didn't want to racially profile these people. So let's be clear. Political correctness ruins lives. It kills people. State censorship by provisions like Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act actually gets people killed. So to the Leader of the Opposition, his Labor colleagues, weak-kneed crossbenchers and the cultural Marxists and the Greens, that's what we want to be able to say. We want to be able to call a spade a spade. We want to be able to call out Muslim drug dealers, child mutilators, hate preachers, terrorists and perverts. Much has been made of the effect of the amendment of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act on ethnic minorities such as the Jewish community. Extreme left-wing organisations such as Get Up have tried to fan concerns that somehow free speech equals hate speech. This line has been enthusiastically run by left-wing secular Jewish pressure groups such as the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council. However, it is utterly untrue to claim that the Australian Jewish community is opposed to the government's proposed amendments to the Racial Discrimination Act. In fact, as Jewish One Nation staff members have been keen to point out, the Rabbinical Council of New South Wales has publicly made statements expressing concern that the existing wording of 18C prevents rabbis speaking out on matters of faith. Going further, in the online journal J-Wire, leading Jewish barrister Jeffrey Block has strongly argued for repeal of Section 18C. As Professor Michael Berenbaum, founder of the Washington Holocaust Museum, has pointed out, discrediting anti-Semitism is much to be preferred to gagging anti-Semites and so infuriating and driving them underground. This is, of course, the reason why I'm happy for the Greens to continue to stand up on their hind legs and give vent to their anti-Semitic spleen in this place. This issue was taken further by the Australian Jewish News in December last year when it argued that, quote, when Jews act to restrict freedom of speech, they undermine their argument against people like Jake Lynch and his cohort, who prevented supporters from Israel from presenting their point of view at Sydney University. And my Jewish friend David Adler strongly supports the removal of 18C. In truth, Mr Acting Deputy President, the real beneficiaries of Section 18C are, of course, Australia's Islamists. Australia's Muslim community is bulging with hate preachers and terrorist apologists, none of whom have ever been brought up before the Human Rights Commission for insulting, humiliating or offending their Jewish, Christian or other secular Australian communities. So apparently the current Section 18C only applies to non-Muslims. No wonder the Greens and Labor want to keep it as it sounds. The fact is, Mr Acting Deputy President, that once you suppress free speech, all forms of other political ills are possible. Civilisation as a whole may pass unremarked and unchallenged from an open society into one of systemic oppression, without the ability of the victims of such tyranny to even speak out against their oppressors. Perhaps the real problem here with those who oppose amending 18C is a lack of understanding of what free speech actually means. Free speech is not the ability to say things that conform to the politically correct consensus that increasingly is dominating our lives. Free speech is the ability to say things that those in power disagree with. It needs to be remembered that even in Stalin's Russia, people were still free to politically agree with Comrade Stalin. But of course, that was no freedom at all. What the thoughtful apologists for Section 18C are really about is silencing criticism of their own actions and ideas, because they see this as the beginning of opposition that may thwart their plans for control of us all. What the Spanish Inquisition, Stalin's Russia, ISIS and the Greens who screeched their support for 18C have in common is their belief that they, and they alone, are right, and that those who disagree with them are not just wrong, but immoral. What they fail to grasp is that this hubris is the common fountainhead of all tyranny. It is no consolation, Mr Acting Deputy President, if the goons who knock on your door in the middle of the night to drag you away are wearing socks and sandals instead of jackboots. In the words of Salman Rushdie, the moment you declare a set of ideas to be immune from criticism, satire, derision or contempt, freedom of thought becomes impossible. In the words of Salman Rushdie,
Senator Roberts, resume your seat. Senator Hanson-Young on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. It's obvious that Senator Roberts has got himself all worked up into a lather here this afternoon, and I understand that he's passionate about this issue. He's giving a very good description as to why freedom of speech is important to him.
Come to the point of your point of order, please.
I think he should consider his reflections on other people in this chamber. But, Senator Roberts, you will always have the defence of satire on your side.
Senator Roberts. Yes, Senator Dastyari.
On the point of order, I also want some clarification from the Acting Deputy President. What are the rules around us being able to bring popcorn into the chamber when Senator Roberts
Senator
next
Dastyari, please resume your seat. Senator Roberts.
We can see that this issue is a comedy issue because the people are abused in this. The people of Australia. Genuinely free societies don't arrest cartoonists, kids at university or reporters because some activist claims that they were offended by what they said. For goodness sake, Mr Acting Deputy President, what has this country come to? How can anyone call themselves a Liberal or even a Social Democrat and allow this Stalinist repression of free speech to continue? I urge senators in the Labor Party and the crossbench who do genuinely believe in free speech, do not be bound by your party's errors. Please think for yourself and consider what sort of society that we all want our children to grow up in. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.